This evening on the Rock Newman Show, Donald Temple is a well-regarded DC-based attorney, activist, and social commentator who heads up one of the nation's leading civil rights law firms. Tonight, Attorney Temple joins me to explore a wide array of issues from the Trump presidency, effects of the government shutdown, and more. That's coming up right now on the Rock Newman Show. Welcome to the Rock Newman Show from the campus of historic Howard University, located right here in the nation's capital. I'm Rock Newman, and it is my desire to inspire you with personal stories of extraordinary achievement. Attorney Donald Temple has been a strong advocate for human and civil rights and leads one of the top civil rights law firms in the nation. He's also a jazz aficionado and has a weekly radio program on DC's WPFW-FM. Tonight, we'll get his views on the Trump presidency, the government shutdown, resurgence of racism in the U.S., and much more. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure.
So, man, there are so many heavy topics that we're going to try to address today in a short period of time. But before I get into the real heavy stuff, you're known in part as the consummate Philly guy. You think about Donald Temple, you think about Donald Temple come to Philadelphia. Some kind of way that just comes there. So if my math is correct, you had to grow up in Philly in the late 50s, early 60s.
Yeah.
Tell me about growing up in Philly at that time.
Well, actually, I mean, the real growing up years took place in the 60s.
Okay.
You know, it's a constant process growing up, but the 60s was high school time, and I grew up under Frank Rizzo as police commissioner and mayor, but I was blessed to grow up in a very, very, very robust, service-oriented, loving family. I had two uncles who were police officers, one a captain, the other a lieutenant in internal affairs. The third brother was the deputy fire commissioner, and all incredible men, and all lending to my value construct. My father was a janitor at the Philadelphia Gas Works, where he worked for 40 years. I tell my students everything that we give is from the broom of my father. My mother is a very literate woman, and I have a very large family. My father had 10 brothers and sisters, my mother 4.
Wow.
She had tons of cousins, very diverse.
You know, you immediately say grew up under Frank Rizzo as police commissioner and then mayor. Frank Rizzo, to the minority community, represented a symbol of not just oppression, but harsh oppression. Famous for having said, "The use I have for a black man is to put my foot in his butt and shine his shoes, to shine my shoes." What do you remember about those times and the reign of Rizzo?
Well, the reign of Rizzo was significantly mitigated by a lawyer in Philadelphia by the name of Cecil B. Moore. Cecil B. Moore, they called him the Lion of North Philadelphia, where I am from. Almost singularly, his leadership skills, his mastery of the law, of the Constitution, his challenging of the system was formidable. When Cecil passed, Frank Rizzo spoke at his funeral and said that he had the highest respect for Cecil. Cecil challenged every ounce of air that Frank Rizzo breathed and every negative thought he had about black people. So I was more under the rubric of the late Cecil B. Moore, and not really, I mean, the context of Frank Rizzo. Frank Rizzo was horrific, you know, but we had many wonderful struggles in the black community, many leaders who, I guess, kind of gave us some guidance and inspiration here, Rock.
Yeah. So let's see, the move fiasco happened in 87.
Correct.
So you had come to Howard University by that time.
I came to Howard in 1971.
Long before that.
Long before
Okay.
then, and finished law school in 78. I was a lawyer on Capitol Hill in 1987, but I was called to Philadelphia, and I actually represented homeowners whose homes were bombed by the fire commissioner at that time.
Yeah, under Black Mayor
Wilson Good.
Black
Yes.
Mayor Wilson Good. So again, before we get into the heavy, here's what I want you to opine on. There is a New York City vibe, whatever that is. Come down, take the Amtrak on down to 30th Street Station and get off in Philadelphia, and there's a Philly vibe. And then you come back on the train and come on down to Washington, D.C., the Union Station, there's a D.C. vibe. I would like Donald Temple to reflect and to give your thoughts on what you think those three vibes are, how they're similar and how they're different.
Well, depending on the timing, certainly when I came to Howard, they were very different. I mean, New York and Philly had a lot in common. We were very street, very urban, very fast, very fast, you know, and we thought we were faster than DC, so coming to DC was kind of a different thing, particularly in the 70s. But as I grew older, I mean, DC is a phenomenal city. I don't consider myself necessarily a Philadelphian now. I'm very much a Washingtonian. My kids were born in, and my kids are Washingtonians, but the style of the Philadelphian, the culture, the class. As a young boy growing up in Philly, I mean, the presentation was phenomenal. We were
What do you mean by that?
Oh, we were wearing tailor-made pants and ballet shoes.
Okay.
We would hustle to buy a pair of $35 ballet shoes with a tassel, tailor-made pants, and the Schiaparelli shirts, which were a silk variation of a variety of colors that would match either our pants or our hats. And so our style was a kind of a Philly cool. And you hear that when people talk about Philly. And we thought we were cooler than New York, and that's why maybe my best friends out of Howard came out of Philly, New York culture. And when Ubiquity started, it was a lot of Philly, New York people there. Back when we started that organization.
You bring up Ubiquity, and we definitely will get into that. Look, I have something I want to read. You wrote on January the 23rd, 2019. Here is what Donald Temple wrote on Facebook. He wrecked his business and the people who trusted him. He is disdainful of the rights of workers and even executives. He harbors extraordinary racial bias. He didn't honor the work of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. He did not honor the work of Dr. King and the civil rights movement. And the government was shut down as he continues to drown in his own self-aggrandizement. Trump is intentional, deliberate, callous, and pernicious. No government, no functional society. Dysfunction fuels disruption. Disruption creates individual and institutional vulnerability, not just for the federal government workers, but for federal program beneficiaries and contractors. To what end? More than $12 billion would be owed to federal government workers due to the shutdown. The number grows daily. Money is lost during government shutdown. Productivity equally lost. The wall is not about the wall at all. It's about Trump's disruption, a pseudo-depression, tactical confusion, and his continued personal, economic, and political exploitation of the American government. No end in sight. Whew, that's a mouthful. What were you feeling when you wrote that?
You know, one can only feel passionate about human suffering and its various machinations. It doesn't have to be black or Latino or white, but our world is suffering and our nation is suffering. The call that I got yesterday from a federal government worker in need was one thing that distressed me. My daughter said to me, "Dad, at the end of the month, there are going to be some things happening in the street because people are not getting their needs met. People who have medical needs, nonetheless food needs, are not getting their needs met. When you contextualize it with the President of the United States, this happens a day or so after Martin Luther King's birthday. Now, you may not like Dr. King, but you cannot possibly have contempt for a movement that changed the personality of this country in terms of its respect for human rights and what it did in terms of the African American community. When the African American civil rights movement hit, it didn't just change the African American community, it redefined America. But to be mama, to say nothing, not to mention that
As the so-called leader.
That so many lives were sacrificed, it's enough to piss you off, whether you're black or white. You gotta say, well, why? And then you gotta think about the direction of the country. Rock, we're at a stage now, we gotta think about not just ourselves, but a wingspan that includes so many people. And then you see a president, and I talk about it's kind of, I always talk about New York con. You talk about New York on the corner, 3-card Molly, boom, boom, boom. We've been undergoing this kind of a presidential con game since 2016 when he was elected. And people are blind to what's happening, whether it's the emoluments clause and all the deals that are probably taking place that we don't know about, that we will soon uncover, the changing of policies in the federal government agencies that benefit a certain economic constituency in the United States, and the constant harsh policy decision-making that hurts even the people that support him in terms of health care and economic kinds of issues. So I think this is a dangerous time. I think that this is a distraction. What's happening with the special counsel and all his boys that have turned against him.
When you say distraction, Donald, I read your piece on Facebook, and then I was flipping through the Washington Post on that same day, January the 23rd. And it talked about, there's an article in the Post on the 23rd that talks about the whitening of the judiciary, that the rollback from minority candidates that are being put forth on the federal judiciary and throughout state systems is significant. As an attorney who fights in that space all the time, what's your reaction?
Absolutely. We saw it with the two Bushes and Ronald Reagan. There were 576 judicial appointments and approximately 12 black judicial appointments in a 12-year period. I can't underscore, Rock, how important a federal judge is. I just can't, and it's a critical issue. And I said it in 2016. If there was no reason to get out and vote, it was to preserve some kind of equality and fairness in the judicial nomination process. It is one of the most dangerous developments under this particular administration.
When you say you can't overestimate the importance of a federal judge, explain to our viewers what you mean when you say that, and what is indeed the value of a federally appointed judge.
Sure. First and foremost, these judges are lifetime judges. Yeah. And there's a three-tier system, as we know: the trial court, United States District Court, the Court of Appeal, and the circuits, and of course the Supreme Court. The power of the federal judge comes into play in the civil and constitutional process and criminal process. The federal criminal codes, the sentencing of persons who are charged with federal crimes is very significant. The judge has so much power on constitutional questions, the interpretation of the Constitution, whether it's in discrimination, whether it's in police brutality, whether it's a First Amendment issue or the like. And when you have judges, and unfortunately, the reality is, and I've been practicing in the federal courts for over 30 years, I can forecast and say, okay, this is a judge's inclination or direction. And not always, but sometimes, more often than not, it's attributed to who appointed them and the basis for that appointment. Judges are not just appointed out of the sky. The judges come from the various states by way of the Senate, who influences the nominations in for maybe the Fourth Circuit, Third Circuit, Second Circuit, and we don't pay attention to that. But when you have to go before these courts with issues, you're mindful of the fact that these judges come with a certain perspective, experience, and oftentimes it's not that a black judge or white judge is necessarily going to decide a case a certain way, but to be open to a variation of your cultural background, a different spin on your intellectual arguments pertinent to the constitutional questions and federal law questions. And I've seen a lot of that, and sometimes, and quite frankly, I'm one who sometimes thinks that a judge can be wrong, and in those situations where you have a court that's stacked with people who think a certain way, it's going to push the interpretation of the laws and even the Constitution a certain way. And Roe v. Wade is one such example. So now everyone's talking about Roe v. Wade in terms of the gender issue and gender equality issue, and we're looking at the court composition and the way the court is going to be changing, and may change even now within the next year or so. If this president gets another nomination, we'll see exactly what that means.
You know, you just gave a statistic, and if it's remotely accurate, that Reagan and Bush, the two Bushes, somewhere 570 appointees.
576, I think.
576 appointees, federal appointees to the judges, to the federal bench. 12, you said, were African American?
That's correct.
12 are African American. So if again, math, 576, 10% would have been 57. 5% would have been 28. 2.5% would have been if it was 14. So it was less than 2.5%. And we represent 12% of the population. And the question now, where they're talking about in that Washington Post article on the 23rd of January that I'm talking about, is the rollback. So it appears as if we're actually headed back to those same numbers.
That period of time, 1980 to 1992, that 12-year period is where these numbers come. We are headed back. I mean, I don't think the president is apologetic about that. I think he's pretty transparent about it. And I think that Mitch McConnell and the Senate are transparent about it. And we have a bunch of people who come with a certain perspective, not accidentally, predominantly pretty senior white men who still probably harbor what Ralph Ellison described as some notion that we're invisible. And whether we acknowledge that or not, that's a reality. You know, we're still invisible, and will become increasingly invisible unless the status quo is fundamentally altered.
I spent 5 years at Howard University, 1978, 1982, as dormitory counselor. And I can tell you, unabashedly and unapologetically, one of my favorite groups was a group you mentioned earlier, was Ubiquity. You were the founder of Ubiquity. What year did you found it?
February 1973.
What was the impetus? What were you trying to accomplish?
Ubiquity is a co-ed service organization that embraces our African-centered culture and that embraced male-female relationships and service to our community. I'm very proud of Ubiquity. I'm very proud of the members of Ubiquity. It introduces us to African-centered literature, self-determinative thinking, and it's rich in culture and it's rich in history. At that particular time in 1973, we, again, a group of people from Philly and New York and other places came together to create something that was kind of more conscious and more cultural. And we tried to build an institution. To its credit, it has been consistent and still exists at Howard University.
So how much influence that, you know, your uncle, they were on the police department, you say your mom was very literate, your dad worked as a janitor, you said so much of what comes from you comes from, you know, your dad's broom. How much of that background, what did that background have to do that prompted you to form a group like Ubiquity?
Family. Ubiquity is based on family. And when all else fails, the relationships you have at Howard University are also family driven. You go through a lot on campus. You go through a lot as an adult, but family is everything. And we created, through Ubiquity, some lifelong friendships and lifelong family relationships. And Ubiquity, one of the mantras is, in this family, we are one. And that's pretty much the tie-in in terms of my family. But I gotta also tell you, Rock, in the early 70s, when I was at Howard, there were absolutely incredible professors and experiences.
Oh, man.
Whether it was Charlie Fry in African American Studies, Haki Maibudi, then Down Ali the poet, Oliver Killens. I had the chance to suck it all in. I was in the drama department. I was a Howard player. As a sidebar, not even as a major. It was great. I was a student government person, so there was a lot of energy, and I was a sponge. I was learning everything. You can go to Crampton on any given day and learn something that the professors at Howard loved the students. They loved to teach, and we loved to learn. So that also informed the notion of, and I think about it because we were 19 when we started Ubiquity, and the constitutional Ubiquity is something. I mean, and it speaks to us in acknowledging our African ancestry. I mean, what important thing. I mean, and so many people want to dismiss Africa and have all kinds of rationales as we assimilate into the dominant culture, but to preserve our identity and to connect to our Africanness is substantial in terms of our own mindsets as we climb the ladder, competitive ladders, wherever we are. And I think it's actually helped a lot of students who come through Ubiquity who are judges, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and the like. And so I'm very proud of that organization and what it means fundamentally.
You've been accused of being cloned because so many things have happened. You was founder of Concerned Black Men, Washington, D.C., and also the Charles Hamilton Houston law school preparation, which as opposed to me trying to describe that, why don't you share with us the Charles Hamilton Houston law preparation class, what it has contributed to Howard University and beyond.
Yeah, well, coming out of Howard and going to law school in California, then coming back from the University of Santa Clara Law School to Georgetown to graduate law school, I looked at the experience of going to law school and realized that, there was no mentorship, that law school was very challenging in terms of analysis, in terms of writing, in terms of attitude. So I tutored a class then at Howard who was going to law school, and I tried to share with them the benefits of my experience. Because I didn't think, I was a first-time college student, first-time law student. So everything I learned, I was learning on my face, but I wanted to make sure that black students going to law school.
When you say first time, you talk about first from your family? From my
family, yes. I wanted to make sure that black students going to law school could learn something, so that tutorial program led to a program that we run now at Georgetown Law Center. We're in our 40th year. We have a very robust, serious, disciplined law school preparation program where we prepare students going to law schools literally all over the country. And I have students now, I can say 40 years later, and I also would say thank you to Georgetown. They have partnered with us and fully supported the engagement of African American, Latino, Asian, and white students who participated in our program, and they embrace it 100%. Our students have gone to Harvard, Stanford, Howard, American, Kentucky, UCLA, Temple, Penn, Columbia, NYU. They're all over the country, and they have what we instill in them is a Houstonian jurisprudence. And Charles Houston, as you know, taught Thurgood Marshall at Howard Law School. And we have educated a lot of Howard students. In addition to that, we bring them into a network of lawyers and judges who mentor and embrace them, guide them in terms of getting clerkships. Our graduates have clerked in the 5th and 9th circuits. They come back, and that's a value that we get, and Howard has given that to me, is that no matter what you get, no matter where you are, we're only here for a minute, but we have to make sure that we're reaching back as we climb, and that's something that God has blessed me with the law students, with the undergrads. As a lawyer, I'm a practitioner, I'm aspiring, I'm growing, but if you can get it to give back to a kid who's in the first year or second year or even undergrad at Howard, and that's what we do, then that gives us a stronger foundation in the justice system to ensure the preservation of the gains that we have, but also to look forward, Rock, into the 21st century to figure out how we do the things that we need to do to protect and develop our community.
Man, hearing you answer that question reminds me of a conversation that I had with someone who I only found out recently you were sort of grew up with at Howard University, and that was Mike Espy, who just ran for Senate in Mississippi, was the former Secretary of Agriculture. Can you kind of reflect back on your days with Espy a little bit? And also, you were in Mississippi as he was seeking that Senate seat.
Sure. Howard University, I mean, just absolutely prepared the most incredible people that I've ever met. Mike and I were at Howard undergrad. We came here in '71. We graduated in '75. We were both in the student government. He was the treasurer of the Liberal Arts Student Council. I was the vice president of the Undergraduate Student Association. And our politics interfaced during that time. Mike was much more progressive intellectually than I was in terms of the spectrum of international kinds of issues. I was more domestic, and he was very international. We actually went to the same law school. We, in Howard, by the time we got to law school, Mike and I was president of the Black Law Student Association. Mike was treasurer. I was the first Black Student Bar Association president. Mike was the first treasurer. So our politics were similar. And when Mike was elected to Congress, I was one of the first people. We started a PAC in 1983. Mike got his first $5,000 check from our Political Action Committee. I was in Mississippi in '86 when he won. When Mike said he was running for Senate, how could I not support who I thought was the most qualified candidate? And Mississippi is a really interesting and challenging state for Black folk. It's not, Mike is not a straight line, but Mike was the best candidate, and Mike he could have won. I hope, and he will run again. If we put our arms around people like that, I think he has a shot. So that's my Mike Espy relationship. I'm honored and humbled to have been in Mississippi and to work on both of those campaigns to try to make a difference there.
Yeah. So you were recently inducted into the District of Columbia and Washington Bar Association's Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Thank you.
What does that mean?
It means I'm getting old. well, you know,
I was gonna say, what does it mean to you?
It's an honor of the highest order. You know, I try. It's something I call the perfection of imperfection. You know, I try to do as much as I can in the Black bar. You know, you can't do enough, Rock. You know, there's not enough of me to do all the work that needs to be done. But it's an honor. I love the Washington Bar to be recognized. And I said I'm getting old, but that is, I've been practicing now for 41 years. And so, and I don't think that. I mean, but that's the mirror that I look into. And it's just an honor. I mean, I'm appreciative of that.
You have a well-known and deserved label as one who fights for civil rights. You also lay claim to practicing civil rights. Describe for us what that is.
Well, so, civil rights is the constitutional foundation that informs largely the freedoms that we have. But there's if you think about the Venn diagram, there is an intersection between economics and constitutional rights, and it's in the center.
You said Venn diagram.
The Venn diagram in math.
Okay.
And in the center of that, that's where it intersects. And oftentimes, we don't look at the economics that are associated with civil rights. So you have people say, oh, I'm not practicing civil rights, but the civil rights inform tremendously our economic influence and our economic empower. Education and its correlation to economics. Police misconduct and its correlation, police misconduct, false imprisonment, false incarcerations, high sentencing correlates to our economic empowerment, and so forth. But in addition to that, there's economic employment, for example, issues, or business, for example, so there are many, many, many economic issues. I have a buddy now, we had a conversation, Howard grad, Wayne Kendall, out of Atlanta. He sued the Atlanta Falcons Stadium. And he's talking about basically how it was financed. And I said to Wayne, who would have thought that this guy coming out of Howard, another ubiquitarian and a good Kappa man, as I am, that coming out of Howard would then, also a Georgetown grad, goes to Atlanta and throws a stone at this issue. I said, Wayne, that's a civil rights issue.
Right.
You're challenging them using tax monies that would otherwise go to education, economics. And so there are many economic issues, and the larger firms realize that, that these issues all have economic implications. And so I think that when I say civil rights, it is civil rights. Civil rights and civil rights almost are interchangeable.
In 1997, that's when I remember Donald Temple's name really kind of coming into prominence. And it surrounded the lawsuit that you and your client filed against Eddie Bauer. And, actually, I'm sure there must have been others before that. But especially here in the DC area, that almost seemed to be like a groundbreaking action. And the betting money was very much that a giant like Eddie Bauer was going to crush a smaller attorney like Donald Temple. Take us back to that case for a minute and share your reflections on that.
Rock, this is a serendipitous life experience, I got to say.
Okay.
Because we represented a young man who was stripped of his shirt at an Eddie Bauer outlet in Prince George's County. And it's a very highly publicized case. At that time, there was 700,000 hits on the case. And the kid came to me, and I thought it was wrong, absolutely wrong. But I didn't think it would take me there. And that was kind of an out-of-body experience because we challenged Eddie Bauer, and we had lots of litigation battles. Of course, they had a big firm, well-financed.
How long did the case last?
That case lasted about a week. And we tried it in Greenbelt. Even the fact that it made it to trial.
But I'm actually talking about from the
process,
time the incident through.
A couple years.
A
couple years.
Yeah, I remember a protracted period.
Yeah, and Rock, I rejected a $400,000 offer at the time for a shirt. So we were really pioneering this theory, and lots of issues, but it was an out-of-body experience. And our point was that we didn't want black kids to be followed and held to a double standard when they're spending all of this money in these stores. And God blessed, God really protected us, number one, in that case, because we didn't have the funds. It was a bloody battle. I mean, the case should have never gone to trial. We went to trial, Rock, and I walked into the courtroom, and there was not a seat in the courtroom. They were bringing chairs in the courtroom. This is like my...
Yeah, when you say highly publicized, this indeed was.
It was something. And we were able to get a verdict. And I think that we were also able to have an impact in the retail industry. Even today, many of the retail industries use that case as a blueprint as to what not to do in terms of how you deal with black customers, and not just black customers. So, yes.
So groundbreaking and historical.
Yeah.
In 2015, you won a $1.7 million case, a whistleblower case against the District of Columbia. Talk to us about that.
That's the Eric Payne case. That case, we got a verdict for 1.7 and the case settled for 3.5. It was probably one of the most difficult cases that I have had. Another uphill challenge against the district. It took 8 years in that case. Every single step of the way, the District of Columbia challenged everything that we did. I mean, there were countless motions, et cetera, et
What was
cetera.
the impetus of the case?
Well,
what happened?
Eric Payne, a lawyer who worked for the Office of Chief Finance Officer, had complained about some of the contracting practices in the lottery, the DC lottery. Well, that was the wrong thing for him to do at that particular point in time. He was he was actually administered to contracts, and he was being pushed to award a contract one way, and he wouldn't, and there were implications, and there were systematic implications. To Eric's credit, I mean, Eric was resilient. It really hurt his family. He ultimately lost his job for years. He couldn't get back into the marketplace, and we went to war. And again, I was very much protected. I say in that particular process.
What do you mean?
Well,
when you say I was protected,
my practice, Rock, quite frankly, is spiritually and culturally informed. I am very. I mean, sometimes our battles, I know that I don't have the resources to all the time to fight, but I rely on my spiritual and religious confluence, and also my ancestral influence. I go to cases, I ask God, and I ask the ancestors to come and to lead me and guide me through cases, and they do. And I can just tell you that I've been blessed to have some significant victories. We've had losses, and there are some tough losses, but we just won a case after 8 years. A lady, we're in year 10 now, who lost her job. We lost in the Superior Court. I mean, we lost at the Office of Employee Administrator, OEA, and Employee Appeals, and we lost at Superior Court, and we won an appeal. And we're now we've gotten her reinstated and a substantial backlog of money. So it's a struggle, but that faith and that insight, because sometimes I don't know. I certainly don't know the answer. We take some hits, but we just keep coming, and it's only through that level of perspective and the hard work. We have a work ethic that I think is competitive. I tell the young lawyers, none of them will outwork us, none of them. So we work hard, and unfortunately, there's not a lot of lawyers who put in the time to try to figure it out. Once you get a hit, you lose. The resilience is difficult, particularly because of the resource issues. You know, so and I have been blessed to know some really incredible lawyers. One who recently died, Charles Pearson. He had some issues, but he was brilliant, and being able to discuss his thinking was a good thing.
You are, you're someone, obviously, you speak proudly of being a Howard graduate, so you obviously have love for Howard University. In spite of that love, you have chosen to represent student protest leaders in times past, decades ago, and also just recently in 2018. And I want to ask you about I want you to compare and contrast the protest 2018 to what it was 20, 30 years ago, and what it says about students, current students today.
You know,
last year you represented the students that shut down the administration building.
You know, Rock, I was one of them. So we start with that. And secondly, you know, they started the trend of having lawyers back in '89. I was minding my business, again, working on the Hill, and I got a call, come up to Howard, the students need you. And it was a blessing again. Students in both instances were the most incredible students. In both instances, they were led by young black women who were remarkable. I mean, just remarkable, disciplined leaders. And the commonality, I don't think there's a lot of difference. Cheek was president then, and Frederick is president now, is that the commonality is that they saw a future of Howard that transcended the administration and encouraged a level of accountability in terms of their own needs, but also the vision of Howard, and they imposed it in both situations on the board and on the respective presidents. And that took a lot of tenacity, a lot of personal sacrifice, and so I think that was a commonality. To the extent that they had a lawyer, my role was not to advise them as to what to do, what was to ensure the protection of their rights and that their views were properly articulated and that there would not be retaliation against them after these respective demonstrations.
And, you know, I think as a disclaimer, I have to say, you know, as a member of the Board of Trustees, I was a part of that process. And when you talk about President Cheek and President Frederick, that especially I'm less familiar with the situation with President Cheek, but in President Frederick's, I think, case was also someone who, as opposed to having been given a reputation of not listening or being aloof, really got in the trenches and did listen and came to a resolution that was best for all involved.
I think that's the case. I mean, I participated, and I think that's the case. However, and there is a big however, this struggle doesn't stop there. The struggle at Howard University is a complex one, and I think that there are things that the administration and the board should do so that they don't look at that as something that was fleeting or in the past. I think that there are things, because we're in a different time.
Stay engaged.
We're in a different time. Howard 2019 does not mean Howard 2049. It doesn't mean Howard 2059.
Sure.
The politics of the country are changing dramatically, and we're moving into an age of technology that's going to have significant implications on our schools and on the marketplace.
As I read from what this piece that you wrote on the 23rd of January, you've expressed privately and publicly very strong feelings about this Trump administration. Now we have a Democratic Congress which is purporting to be willing to hold him accountable, which was unlike every shred of evidence that one would take a look at, would say that the Republican Congress before the 2018 election, in 2 years, they did nothing to hold him accountable. They rubber stamped what many think was his madness. One, I'd like for you to speak on the GOP's what seemed to have been an abdication of their responsibility as a Congress in both houses, and then what are the obligations and challenges of the Democrats who've now taken over?
Outside of the Holocaust Museum, there's a sign, and it says, "If it can happen, it can happen again. If it can happen, it can happen again." Adolf Hitler was able to rise to power because of the acquiescence of people with powers who did not hold him accountable, where there were no checks and balances. Who would think that something like that could happen in the United States?
Right.
If it happened, it can happen again. So by the Republican Senate, again, and the Republican House leadership being mum on the first 2 years of this administration, the administration was able to roll back policies that we don't even know, programs that we don't even know, that have financial implications on our larger community, okay, to appoint judges that are going to participate in that rollback of rights and the like. So it's a disaster for the larger society. And I'm not talking about black or white society, I'm talking about society. And I think that even as we speak, the disruption caused by the shutdown, the politics of the quote-unquote wall, and the relationship between the administration, Trump in particular, with Putin, requires heightened vigilance. Because things can happen in this country, even with the Democratic House. Things can happen in this country that can happen in this world that we think happens over there somewhere in Europe or Asia or Africa, that could potentially happen here. So having a Democratic House is critical. There will be certainly oversight hearings, and the House has subpoena authority. So the House is, and that's another reason why I think there's this issue of delay and government shutdowns, because when these subpoenas are issued to these government agencies and they get information that have to do with the flow of capital, I think there is extensive corruption. I don't know if you know, but during
corruption
in the government.
Okay.
And then during the Ronald Reagan administration, there was extensive corruption. A lot of Reagan people were indicted. I think that is the case here. I think there's extensive corruption. I'm talking about among these various agencies and their officials.
And your observation of the Mueller investigation into this administration. That's one thing, and I'm going to ask you really to play pundit here, because you mentioned Trump's relationship with Putin. I'm going to ask you, your seasoned legal experienced answer to that relationship, to the Putin-Trump relationship. How do you define it? What do you think's going on?
Oh, first of all, I'm not a criminal lawyer, but I will tell you what I think politically, and I've thought it for some time. People are too soft on that. I think, and I've said for 2 years, there's a potential treason issue here.
Mm-hmm.
Treason.
Capital T.
Okay, and I think that is understated often. I think that there's collusion, there's financial collusion. The article that was published some years ago, Trump's Russian laundromat, I commend to people's attention. It's a dissertation in about 8 pages of relationships. Now they're coming out and you're seeing it in the various folk who've turned states' evidence. There's a problem there. And I think that there is a relationship. And I think that decisions are being made that are adverse to the nation's interests, NATO included in particular, and others. And they're being made because the president is not making the calls.
That's a powerful statement, that the president is beholding to Putin in a manner that he's doing the bidding of Putin. Is that your?
And that is potentially treasonous, absolutely. And it's coming out in the wash as we speak in many variations, and it will continue to come out in the wash, and that is all the reason to mute the Mueller investigation with all the dynamics. So you have a closed government, this, that, you know, you have some dynamics, and we're watching the Attorney General Barr's comments pertinent to the nominees' comments about this investigation and the like. And so we're getting to a place, and we always say, and I've been saying for some time, we're at a place where there's potentially a constitutional crisis, where the Constitution doesn't have the teeth to protect society because the checks and balances are thrown out of key.
So, with the new Democratic Congress in, there's been a lot of debate about whether it's politically feasible, strategic, or otherwise to seek impeachment. Your advice to those on Capitol Hill?
The president will be impeached by the House of Representatives. It's just a matter of time. We don't know what Mueller is going to do, but you've heard the discussion in the hearings about whether or not his report would be released in totality or a summary of the report. That report has to be damning. It has to be damning. Given the people, the Flynn, the Cohen, the people that, the Manafort, all the dynamics in the back, the backdrop of those various criminal developments. And so the House knows right now, as we speak, those in the leadership know, they have information today that implicates the president and substantiates the basis for impeachment. Remember though, the House may impeach, but if the Senate doesn't act, the president may be an impeached president, we've seen it before, and play out the balance of his term. And it doesn't mean he won't run in 2020.
Right. As we move towards the end of our time, how quickly it has gone by, you have added another chapter to the legacy and life of Donald Temple. You recently started a jazz program at WPFW, which is just up the street here. WPFW FM, 89.3 on the dial. Why did you decide to do a music program, a jazz program, as you've done?
Because I love, one is that I don't want to talk all the time. I'm invited to talk. I talk for a living. I write for a living. But I love music. And more importantly, Rock, you know, music is the common language, the common universal language of humankind. 15, 25, 50 people could sit in a room and they speak 15, 20, 25, 50 different languages, and you give them a sheet of music and they could play the most beautiful concerto, you know? But more importantly, in the same breath, music touches people's heart and soul. They can hear one song and it's bam. And through my music program, which is called Loveology, I'm able to advocate something that's consistent with my spiritual beliefs and political and cultural beliefs. One is in a tribute to Frances Cress Welsing, is that we have to love ourselves and everything about ourselves. And in loving ourselves, it gives us a capacity, a heightened capacity to love others around us and not to have this contaminated way or attitude about our existence. Life is short. And so to the credit of WPFW, they actually came to me about a legal matter, and I talked to them about their matter, and they wanted me to do a talk show. And I said, no, listen, I like to do music. So my show is, by the comments that we get, people are loving the show. The music is spectacular, and it's not a show as much as a concert or an experience in what we are able to put together.
And you do that. What do you want to get out of it, and what do you want your listeners to get out of it?
Well, first of all, when you're dealing with the law all day long and all the stuff with all the judges and all the cerebral thinking, this is a quiet space and outlet for me personally to decompress and to tune into something else that I enjoy. And for the listeners, I want them to get a feeling. I want them to feel good. I want them to feel rich. Somebody said to me last week, man, your show is like having a Friday on a Wednesday night, a Friday night on a Wednesday night. So that's a nice little gift that if we can give the people, make a little difference in how they feel, that's good. That's cool.
So Donald, there's been, from your childhood coming in, being the first child from your family to have a college education, go on for, graduate, getting your law degree and the rest, and the incredible journey that you've had. What's in Donald Temple's future? What drives you now? What drives you? What's out there for you to? What's next for you to accomplish?
The life of Joseph Temple and Ursula Temple, my parents, and their sacrifices. But what I see in my community and the need for us to give more to protect our community. I don't care if I'm 65, 75, 85. We have to do more in this age to preserve what we have. We're now 400 years, 1619 to 2019, and in our hearts, I think that black people have to change the way that we think, Rock. I think that we have to begin to understand who we are and stop the antiquated, old thinking, to realize the power and significance of institutions, of self-sufficiency, of self-determination, of collectivism and collaboration. We're in a different space. And again, technology is going to teach us some harsh lessons. So we need to have leadership, we need to have vision, and we need to understand what our capacity is in terms of making a difference.
We have about 2.5 minutes left, and I'd heard you talk at some point about a dearth of leadership, and perhaps more importantly, a lack of a plan for the African American community. I'd like you, in the 2 minutes we have left, to speak to what you think that plan needs to include.
Rock, number one, values. Our values, how we think. We tend to have a hole in our pocket when it comes to the dollar. We want to make everybody rich. There are 26 billionaires who have more wealth than 50 million black people.
Yes.
Okay, and so that's one thing. And understanding the context of our relationships, how we treat ourselves, how we treat our brothers and sisters, our neighbors, our families, our children, our elders, and how we value those institutions. We have to adjust our behavior in that respect. And then we have to find a commonality. People always talk about what we have to do. We have to define who the we is. Everybody is not part of the we. But if you get people who are part of the we to be more collaborative, it's critical. Dr. King spoke about having a blueprint. You can't play a football game without a game plan, Rock. There's a first quarter, second quarter, third quarter, fourth quarter. There's timing. People have different roles, etc. It's not just about Trump. It's not just about the Black Caucus or the Congress in the House. We have some of the best educated minds in the world, you included, and others, these gentlemen around you, these ladies around you. But we have to create the institutions to maximize the resources so that we have the capacity. It's all about capacity. It's all about being able to respond to a Katrina. It's all about being able to respond even to a Trump. You know, it's not just
to a government shutdown.
So it's not about just rhetoric. We have to find something that's meaningful and change the paradigm. Our piece, Howard University should not be questioning its future.
Yeah.
WPFW shouldn't be questioning its future. You know, our kids should not be having second-class educations.
You mentioned Howard, you mentioned WPFW. You're talking about institutions, and that if the mind is right and if we're thinking correctly, there would be no question about either.
And if we're disciplined in making the personal sacrifices, there are 168 hours in a week, Rock.
Yeah.
And what we do with that time is significant. We turn off the TV, stop wasting the time, and focus on what counts.
Let me tell you, man, I've been doing this 5.5 years, and it took a Philly producer named Tony Regusta to reach out and to get you to have you on. Thank you so very much, man, for coming.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And indeed, we are one. Frankie Beverly says that at the beginning of my show all the time. That wraps us for this evening. For more information on this program or any other program produced by WHUT, go to WHUT.org. Goodbye, and may God bless you.
This program was produced by WHUT, Howard University Television, and made possible by contributions from viewers like you. Thank you.